Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your remarks with which I agree wholeheartedly and that I endorse without reservation. The blue slip, we have to remember, is not an inexorable command. It was not written on stone tablets. It's not in our Constitution. It's not in the Senate rules. It is a tradition, and it's a tradition that, as you note, Mr. Chairman, has been applied inconsistently at best, and the application that you're employing now is as consistent with any historical iteration of the blue slip tradition as any other that I know of. I'm very pleased and indeed honored to be here to introduce my friend Dan Bress to the committee. Dan's credentials are themselves impeccable, and they're really, really impressive. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard University. He graduated from the University of Virginia Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the University of Virginia Law School Law Review. After finishing law school, he served two very impressive clerkships. First, he served as a law clerk to the Honorable J. Harvie Wilkinson on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, a fantastic judge for whom my brother also clerked, and I know you can't get out of a Wilkinson clerkship without being really well trained in the law. He then went on to clerk for Justice Scalia, a man who was revered far and wide by people who share his ideological viewpoints and by those who don't, because of his intellectual rigors. And the training that he puts his law clerks through is known far and wide as being something that makes for incredible lawyers and very well-qualified jurists. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and for acknowledging that we're dealing with a nominee who is not only exceptionally well-qualified, but who is also very much a Californian. Dan was born and raised in California, and he's maintained a deep connection to the state of his birth throughout his entire career. During college, he served as an intern here in Washington, D.C. for Senator Feinstein. He spent both of his summers in between his first and second year of law school and his second and third year of law school, interning on the California Supreme Court and working as a summer associate at a law firm in San Francisco. After finishing his clerkships, Dan returned to San Francisco to work at a law firm. He later joined Kirkland & Ellis, where he's currently a partner, and he divides his time between Washington, D.C. and the firm's San Francisco office. He spends summers in his hometown of Gilroy, California, and is the part owner of his family's California-based real estate company. Dan has also maintained a strong connection in the California legal community specifically. Much of his practice is based in California. He's litigated dozens of cases in the Ninth Circuit, and we have to remember the Ninth Circuit is itself a place that is inextricably intertwined with California. If you took the Ninth Circuit and you divided it up, it's impossible to divide it up in a way that wouldn't result in a larger circuit than any other circuit in the country, even if you took the unusual, unprecedented step and made California its own circuit. It is a California-specific circuit. There was a federal magistrate judge in Utah by the name of Ronald Boyce who used to harass attorneys who would cite Ninth Circuit precedent as if they were controlling in Utah, which is within the 10th Circuit. And he would point out when lawyers did this, there are no palm trees. If you don't see palm trees outside this courthouse, we've got nothing to do with the Ninth Circuit. Dan Bress's litigation in the Ninth Circuit has been amidst palm trees. It's been in California, and his California-based practice isn't even limited to the Ninth Circuit. He's also litigated cases in federal district courts in California and in California's state court system. He's contributed to articles on legal issues to San Francisco Magazine, including with Ninth Circuit Judge Michelle Friedland, and he serves on the recruiting committee at his law firm to recruit students from California law schools. I'm confident that Dan will make an outstanding federal judge, and I'm looking forward to hearing his testimony this morning. I know Dan not only from the practice of law, but also from our clerkships together. I clerked for Justice Alito the year that Dan was clerking for Justice Scalia. I found Dan always to be one who was interested in communicating with any of his colleagues, any of his peers, on any issue at any time, regardless of their ideological background or the background of their respective justice. Dan was someone who had a calming, reassuring, and always informing influence on everyone around him. This makes him uniquely well qualified for the bench. As to the point that he is not sufficiently Californian, let me say this. In addition to his many ties to California that I've just identified, in his personal life and his professional life, I can point out that if I just identify even a few Western states, there are judges who have been appointed to the 10th Circuit in Utah or in Colorado, or to the 9th Circuit in Nevada or in California, who are far less Utahns or Coloradans or Nevadans or Californians than Dan Bress is a Californian. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think the record is really very clear. Go for it. Is he supposed to go for it? I think the record is really very clear that you are not from out of state. You are not a carpetbagger. You are, in fact, a Californian. You were born and raised in California, and you now split your time between Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. This is not unusual in the practice of law. It is especially not unusual for someone who specializes, as you do, in litigation, often in litigation before federal courts, often in litigation involving federal courts of appeals. In fact, it's well known that Washington, D.C. is something of a hub for lawyers who want to specialize in appellate litigation. There are a lot of firms that have their headquarters in another place, but have the flagship of their appellate practice based in Washington, D.C., and in many cases, the flagship of their litigation practice based in Washington, D.C. That makes you no less of a Californian merely because, in light of that and family considerations, you chose to come back to Washington, D.C. a few years ago. I want to make some comparisons to some other examples of some other jurists with similar background. Let's take, for example, California Supreme Court Justice Leandra Kruger. Justice Kruger was born and raised in California and then attended college and law school on the East Coast, just like you, Mr. Bress. She worked in California during both of her law school summers, just like Mr. Bress. She clerked for an appellate court on the East Coast and then clerked on the U.S. Supreme Court, just like Mr. Bress. After her clerkships, she was a practicing attorney in Washington, D.C. But unlike Mr. Bress, Justice Kruger had a practice that was not focused in California. She had less experience practicing in California state courts and in the federal courts based in California. And unlike Mr. Bress, she did not divide her time between Washington, D.C. and California, as Mr. Bress does. So I wonder if my colleagues would think that Justice Kruger has insufficient ties to California to be serving on the State Supreme Court of California. This is not, of course, the only example, and other examples abound in state and federal courts. Let's take, for example, Justice Neil Gorsuch. Neil Gorsuch was born and raised in Colorado, and then he attended high school, college, and law school on the East Coast. He clerked on an appellate court on the East Coast, and then on the U.S. Supreme Court here in Washington, D.C. After that, he worked in private practice here in Washington, D.C., and then in the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. All this before being nominated and later unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate for a position on the Denver-based U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. What about Judge Robert Katzmann? Judge Katzmann was born and raised in New York City. He attended college in New York City, but he went to graduate school and law school in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. He served as a law clerk in Massachusetts, and then he served as a law professor here in Washington, D.C. He did this, as I understand it, for a decade or so before being named to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit as a nominee from New York. Well, this is all very instructive. Mr. Bress's nomination is not unprecedented, as some have incorrectly suggested. To the contrary, he has substantial and continuing ties to California. More, I would submit, than many of the judges I've just named. And those judges are not alone. For every one of those I identified, I bet I could find many others who similarly had less of a connection to the state where they now serve as federal judges than Mr. Bress does to California. Mr. Bress's connection to California is not isolated or sporadic. It is continuous and systematic. It is something that reflects a lifelong devotion to that state where he was born, where he was raised, where he still owns property interests, where he still has a very substantial part of his law practice. The real issue here, and I think we will be better served as colleagues on this committee if we acknowledge what it is that Mr. Bress is young, extremely bright, exceptionally well qualified. And some of my colleagues think that they may disagree with his judicial approach, with his jurisprudential philosophy. Now, if that's the basis for this discussion, if that's the real focus of this debate, then let's have that debate. Let's not pretend Mr. Bress is not a Californian, because he is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.